So this is, while we're working on the light situation, this is the political governance panel, the second one will be economic governance, and we have a nice diversified panel. We have a journalist, we have a university expert on governance and the environment, and we actually have, and God bless him for being with us today, a representative of government. Is the microphone not working, or am I just not talking loud enough? Is there something I need to do to this to make it work? I guess I just have to speak into it, okay? All right, we may all have to do that then. So I'm sort of substituting for Michael Renner here, he of the broken hand, and probably a poor substitute at that. But I think what I'll do, each of our speakers is going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. We have an hour. I will ask each of them a kind of an opening question to launch them on the talk. I think we'll go in order that we're listed here. So Petra Bartosevich, and then David Orr, and then Jamie Raskin. I'll introduce each of them before they speak. We'll let each of them speak, and then either, depending on how much buzz I hear in the room, I'll either ask another leading question to each of them after they speak, or we'll just simply take questions from the floor. And I know Jamie has a lot going on, so I should ask, are you available for an hour? Or
yes.
Are you, great. Well, thanks so much for that. Great. So we'll start with Petra, who wrote the chapter, The Too Polite Revolution, that Tom mentioned about the failure of the federal cap-and-trade legislation succeeded in the House, failed in the Senate, obviously failed in the federal government. Petra is a freelance journalist and is currently a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan. And she wrote the chapter with Marissa Miley, who also is a freelance journalist. Petra is based in Brooklyn, Marissa in Boston, and Marissa is also a correspondent for Global Post, as I understand it. So Michael's given you questions, and I'm to follow them, but it's not in my nature to follow them perfectly. I might bend them just a little bit. Basically, you discussed the failure of the cap-and-trade climate legislation as an experience that was in sharp contrast with the experience of the environmental movement with the early 1970s environmental legislation, which was successful. And your basic diagnosis seems to be that the cap-and-trade legislation was way too much of an insider ball game, too sort of focused with foundations and top green groups all working together on one strategy, not a diversified one, and particularly failing to energize grassroots. Is that the main reason that you think that it failed? And I guess I would like to add to that, can you imagine a vision by which a more grassroots-oriented movement and more diverse environmental and philanthropic movement could have sufficiently energized enough grassroots energy to actually make cap-and-trade succeed in 2009?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today. And Marissa is actually joining us on the live cast. So hello, Marissa. And as Bob mentioned, we are freelance journalists. We were commissioned initially to look at this issue by the Rockefeller Family Fund, and in conjunction with the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And I mention that only because as journalists, this was a different approach than we've taken in the past to reporting. We were asked really to look mainly at the assumptions of the major green groups who were involved in this campaign. And you asked, would a better connection with grassroots have possibly made a difference? I think that's, yes, short answer. And no, short answer. We looked at what was considered by the green groups as the opportunity of a generation to pass a comprehensive federal cap on carbon emissions. And that was because when President Obama was elected to his first term, he was considered friendly to environmental interests. He had campaigned on this issue. John McCain, his primary opponent, had campaigned on this issue. And it almost looked inevitable that something would happen. And in preparation for this, the green groups started to look at how they were going to pass this major legislation. And they decided that they would try to broker a compromise solution with the major polluters in this country. They formed the U.S. Climate Action Partnership in 2007, I believe. And that was sort of the beginning of a discussion, a long series of discussions about what that legislation would look like. And then you also mentioned, that they were modeling themselves on previous successes, 1990s acid rain legislation passed under the first George Bush. And that's all true, and those I think were good assumptions, but they also may have contributed to some of the failure because at the time President Bush was very engaged in the process of seeing that legislation pass. He had also campaigned on the issue. He had made promises to swing state environmental voters, and he took a very strong hand through his administration to be on the floor of the House and Senate to push that legislation through. That did not happen under the Obama administration. President Obama was occupied by the healthcare legislation, by the floundering economy, and also I think generally his style was different than was anticipated. He was not as hands-on. He was waiting to see some momentum. And what we spoke with some 70-plus stakeholders on the issue, mainly the green groups, some legislators, activists, and our conclusion really was that the legislation was compromised from the start. The deal making was so intense, and there were so many giveaways to industry that by the time it passed in the House in 2009, though that was a landmark piece of legislation, it had not accomplished the goals that the environmentalists wanted to see, and it had also it had been politically difficult for those House members who voted for it. And the Green groups had not anticipated this, and then when this went to the Senate, they were ill prepared, I think, to fight what would have been an extremely grueling battle to pass anything in the Senate. And this occurred despite unprecedented money being thrown at the issue. In the run-up to President Obama's first term, over $1.1 billion was allocated through ClimateWorks, a sort of consortium of funders who came together, and they all sort of agreed on this strategy of pushing for a carbon cap. And they connected with the large green groups who then were pushing for a carbon cap. And we looked a lot at this intersection of cause and effect of one policy, the money all being at that policy. And I think it certainly had an effect that a lot of money went towards this approach, and it was being spearheaded by a small group of environmental organizations. And in the end, what happened was that the bill failed in the Senate, and it failed so badly, no legislation went to the floor even for a vote, that I think it actually set back the efforts for federal climate legislation. The green groups were ultimately outplayed by the corporations that they were up against. They were weakened by the compromises they agreed to make, and they were completely disconnected from the grassroots efforts that across the country have had more success, I would argue, on climate change than the green groups combined. The grassroots, of course, are the people who engage and organize and are passionate about issues that are local to them, and they have not been traditionally engaged with by the large green groups who are located here in Washington. We looked a little bit at the history of that. I found that very interesting. I had not read on this this issue that the green groups have kind of made this shift to inside the Beltway over the decades. They began, some of the biggest groups began as making legal cases for environmental legislation, which was very successful in the 70s and 80s. But over time, that has become a kind of inside the Beltway strategy, and it has disconnected itself from the grassroots, which I believe would have made a major difference. I think that really ultimately going forward is the biggest challenge, because we often talk about what we should do. I actually once had a really great therapist who said, Petra, you're always talking about what you should do. Let's talk about what you do. And that means let's look at the lay of the land. Let's look at what is actually happening. We all kind of agree on what should happen. We should reduce carbon emissions. I mean, even corporate emitters might say we should not, let the climate spin out of control. I hope that they would at least agree to that point. But we don't really talk enough about what is happening. And in Washington, politicians are very much, I think, about realpolitik, what is happening, who their constituents are. Their powerful constituents are oftentimes the funders, the corporations that are funding. And they're looking also at jobs, and the green groups have not traditionally engaged on that issue of job creation. And politicians have to look at that, and that is what their constituencies are concerned about. And those things have to be weighed against the cost. And that is an area where I think journalists and the public in general have not really, we could do a better job. We certainly could do a better job, because the costs of these really dirty energies, the tar sands, for example, are very, very serious. The consequences are very visceral, and we don't think about that very often. I assume you all know about the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. How many of you have heard of the spill outside of Kalamazoo in 2010? All right, well, this is very green. But it's a less known, it is known, but it is a less known, it's the largest inland oil spill in American history. And I've been in Michigan the last 8 months, so I actually went to Kalamazoo a couple weeks ago, and I looked at the site of this spill. It's been covered over. Enbridge, the company that was responsible for the pipeline burst, has buried that site. But we walked around and we went down the river, and it looked pretty normal until you took a closer look. And we took sticks and we dug into the bottom of the riverbed, and suddenly the silt had covered everything. But suddenly, as you dug, oil began to spill out of the ground, and you could see these dark ink, almost like ink plumes coming out, traveling down the river. And I realized at that moment that part of the problem is that the earth is so tolerant of the damage we do to it, has been so, in many ways, patient with the damage that we do to it. It has almost covered up for us. But the damage is certainly being done, and the community there certainly suffered a great deal for the damage that was done there. And I don't think that story was well told enough and public enough and pursued enough. And to this day, it is something that impacts that community. Those are real impacts happening from real energy exploitation. So I would argue that the grassroots, where all this is happening at the local level, is what we do need to engage.
Great. All right, thanks. Excellent. I think Petra's article, once again, Petra's article and comments raise really pointed questions for the environmental movement. There is a diversity within the green group. There are a lot of different green organizations. Not all of them were supportive of cap and trade, of course, but quite a few of the most influential ones were. And also just this tough question of how do we mobilize government, how do we mobilize NGOs, and how do we mobilize people around an issue that's much more abstract than, say, healthcare or the economic collapse was at the time that Obama was wrestling with these. So they're great questions that need to be raised. So our next speaker is David Orr, who I would say needs no introduction. He's been here a number of times, and a lot of you know him, but I'll introduce him anyway. And he's a good and old friend, and my daughter went to Oberlin College, his school, so I've followed him with some interest for quite some time. He's currently a counselor to the president of Oberlin College. He's just transitioning from being the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environment and Governance, which makes him really well suited for this. He's also a prolific author, and he wrote the foreword to our volume this year, which I highly recommend you read. He starts by writing that long before the climate crisis was the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, it was a massive political and governmental failure. And he analyzes this in the context of not merely the environmental aspects of this issue, but the fact that we have social and political problems and liabilities in the way we try to plan for the future and the way we try to deal with major social problems, and that there's a diminished capacity of public institutions to foresee these challenges, to plan for action, and to actually solve problems, and that the environment fits broadly into this fundamental diminished capacity that we're suffering from across governments. And he suggests 4 potential pathways to overcome the problem we're facing. So I'm going to ask you, David, to go through these pathways, and I'm curious, silver bullet, probably not, but what's your own preferred mix of these, or where do you see the logical strategy in these pathways where we can apply the most hope to the situation? And I think you'll have to use this mic.
Well, Bob, thanks for that. This is a, could you hear me in the back? This is totally impromptu. I was trying to crib off Bob's notes to find out what I was going to be asked. Is this, Edith, a little closer like that? Put it on my chin? Just take a bite out of it. Let me start with a story. In a past life, years ago, I worked in and around the Georgia State Capitol, and it was the tail end of Jimmy Carter's governorship. And President Carter, then Governor Carter, had kind of a dubious relationship with the Georgia legislature, and for reasons that will take no imagination on your part to comprehend. And so he reported at a press conference late one afternoon in 1974 that the Georgia legislature was a bunch of do-nothings, and elaborated at some length on that. And I was in the Capitol the next day and going through offices and meeting with people in the Senate. And a guy from Valdosta in the Georgia Senate said, "David, come on in here. I got to talk to you." And he knew I talked to the governor from time to time. And he said, "You know, the governor shouldn't have said that." I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, everybody knows we don't do nothing, but he don't have to go and say it publicly, does he?" And the Carter administration was interesting because Governor Carter and President Carter was an extraordinarily intelligent person, and he saw issues far ahead. It wasn't a lack of leadership, but it was a lack of something that was political, deeply political. And when Carter went into the White House, before he went into the White House, a group of us, including Dennis Hayes, at that time who worked at Worldwatch with Lester Brown and Amory Lovins and Herman Daly and a group of people that you all know, came together around a statement that we call the Wolf Creek Statement. Carter had asked for a document on the most important environmental issue that his administration would face. And so I was tasked with pulling people together, and we did that with a colleague, Cecil Phillips, who at that time was the executive director of the Georgia Conservancy. And went to the Wolf Creek Lodge up in North Georgia, locked the door, and drafted a statement. And that statement still reads well. To our national shame, that statement still, and we did mention climate change. It was mostly about energy, environment, and then also climate, but that was 1976. When Carter left office, he left in 1980 with a document called the Global 2000 Report. And if you remember that report, had we acted on that report within that decade or the next, I don't think 9/11 would have happened. We would have nipped off or cut off the worst of what can happen and probably will happen with climate change. But we didn't, because the public decided in that election of 1980 that it was going to be morning in America again. And now it's twilight. And we have to reckon with the consequences of some really awfully bad judgment. Two comments out of this, and I forgot, I'm going to have to crib off Bob's notes to find out what my 4 pathways were, but I'm going to buy a little bit of time before I look at the notes. But the issues in 1980 had already been subverted. Do all of you know the Lewis Powell memo? All right, you got a homework assignment. That's what ex-professors do. We give reading assignments. Google Lewis Powell memo. Now, if there's any group that needs to know this memo, you're it. This was the start of a counterattack on the environmental movement. Justice Powell was an attorney in Richmond. He was later named to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Powell memo was the strategy that launched this right-wing counterattack on the environmental movement. And it was the start of a number of organizations, notably the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, the Hudson Institute. They began to give this right-wing view cover and some degree of intellectual respectability. So you will all Google and read the Powell memo So repeat after me. I will Google and read the Powell Memo. And I'm serious about this. We need to know our history. And so what was happening in the 1970s wasn't just a failure of the grassroots. This was a well-orchestrated, extremely well-funded effort that continues to this day. The McCutcheon decision is just a logical outgrowth of this. Citizens United was a logical outgrowth. The Federalist Society, which was the right-wing group that was going to take over courts and so forth, began to move into law schools. And so virtually all the big law schools have chapters of the Federalist Society. It's not all bad. I mean, there are cases on both sides to be made. But their case, the case that they made in this whole way, was pretty far to the right. And there was very little room for environment in this. If it had nothing to do with markets or free enterprise or individualism, then it didn't appear in those kind of courses and so forth. And so this was a right-wing frontal assault. It wasn't all that the grassroots were wrong or were inactive. There was grassroots activity. Now, on the, Bob, let me get back to the question I was asked here. What's the...
This is from Michael. You had suggested pathways. Let me borrow this for a second, just to refresh all of our memories who've read the chapter. First pathway is to let the market take over. Second one is to bolster public institutions. Third is to work for and insist on accountable and democratic central governments. I would consider that, I guess, national governance. And the fourth is to develop an alert, informed, ecologically literate, thoughtful, and empathic citizenry. So if you can just comment on what mix of those is going to work, it'd be great.
Oh, all the above. I don't think you can separate any of those things out and say that one or the other works. The difficulty I think we have is that, and this is in the report, it was in last year's report as well, sometime around the Powell Memo, there was a concerted effort located at the University of Chicago, primarily, to make neoclassical economics the fundamental dogma of the profession. And so names like Milton Friedman and so forth was based on the Austrian group that came over near or just before World War II, and dominated. It was the reaction to John Maynard Keynes. And so of all those four, I think the elephant in the room is economics. And the difficulty we have is that the economic paradigm that's being presented is roughly 238 years old. That was a paradigm that began with the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776. The problem we have in this room is that the laws of economics don't calibrate very well with the laws of the way the natural world has evolved over 3.8 billion years. And so no place was nature to be valued. And that has come down as a result. Our culture now pushes a bow wave of debt off in front of it, and we offload. There was one study that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007 or 2008 that showed that something like 80-some% would be a pretty accurate guesstimate of our cost of our economy simply offloaded on other people in third world areas or future generations. But that was there was no place. Prices didn't tell the truth. And then there is the other side of this. Edward Bernays was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And do all of you know the name Edward Bernays? I don't repeat what's known. Let me see the hands of those who know Edward Bernays. Okay, well, a number of you do. For those of you who don't, Google Edward Bernays. That's your second assignment. This is a graded thing. You'll get a quiz in the mail. 2 more minutes. Edward Bernays figured out, as Freud's nephew and a devotee of Freudian psychology, that what sold wasn't rational argument up here or do-goodism. You had to go down into the id. So remember the superego, the ego, the id. So you had to go down into the id to sell things. And so you got down into people's grievances, their fears, their hatreds, and so forth. So if you want to sell cars, you made them symbols of sexual potency, and you could sell the annual style change. If you want to sell cigarettes to the market that doesn't buy cigarettes, that was mostly at that time women, you made smoking a cigarette what he called little torches of freedom, rebellion against men. Now, the problem is we have an economy that Lewis Mumford said years ago basically violates or requires the violation of the 7 deadly sins. You remember the 7 deadly sins? Way back in your, anyway. There's your third assignment. So there's a third assignment. But we have an economic model that doesn't calibrate with the way the Earth works. That was what Lewis Powell was selling. And in the 1950s, or from the late 30s to the, say, early 1960s, we built a middle class in this country. It was that middle class that supported the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Wilderness Act. That was the political basis for that legislation we look back very fondly to now. The disintegration of that middle class is the basis on which the right wing has led this assault on the natural systems. So let me stop there.
Thanks, David. Great. Well, I can tell I'm already formulating some questions to stimulate this crowd and this panel afterwards, because we're I guess I won't need to. It won't involve Googling, but some good conversation anyway. Senator Jamie Raskin is the majority whip of the Maryland State Senate. And I might add, my senator. I live in Montgomery County, which Jamie represents in Maryland Senate. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. We've had enough of them, and I don't want to frighten them. But there probably are some other Montgomery Countyans in the room, so we'll be listening with voters' ears. He's also a neighbor, and so I'll probably go kind of easy on him. But in addition to his political duties, which of course puts him in the heart of a key level of government, and I might say as a Marylander, a very important state related to sustainability. Jamie is also a professor at American University of Constitutional Law, the First Amendment, and legislative process, and he's the founding director of the Program on Law and Government at American University's Washington College of Law, which really suits him perfectly for this book. He didn't actually write a chapter, but we consulted with him, and he was good enough to write a little commendation on the back cover that I hope you take a look at. And he's close to all these issues. He's been very active on sustainability. He was instrumental in particular in a topic that will come up in our second panel from Colleen Cordes in getting Maryland to pass the very first piece of legislation in the country, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, to establish state ground rules for the establishment of benefit corporations, the first of which was actually a pet store in Tacoma Park, I believe. Anyway, in Jamie's case, it's interesting to ask, basically we've all dumped a little bit on the federal process. I think Tom, Petra, myself, and David. Jamie works at a different level of government, and a level of government than many of us who've been sort of discouraged by the lack of progress in Washington. Look to states and see California has some interesting climate legislation that's really doing something, is capping carbon in at least a fashion, and Maryland and a lot of other states have done things as well on sustainability. And so I guess the question I would ask Jamie is, do you have any inside knowledge that nobody's ever heard yet that you can share about this process? No. If you do, it'd be great. But the main one is, can states bring us to sustainability? What is the role of states and perhaps even more local forms of government who do things on sustainability to actually solve these big global problems? Is it possible, or shall they settle to dealing with the sort of the more local pollution, water supply, ground cover kinds of issues that affect their states? What's the potential for states to really take on the really big sustainability issues?
Thank you, Bob. I'm delighted to be here with everybody. And Bob revealed my secret, which is I did not actually exert myself to write a chapter for the book, but I did write a blurb, so I'm here to discuss my blurb today. Everybody could just read it for themselves, and I would retire. But I'm delighted to be here with you guys. I found it sobering to hear the prior speakers before our panel went on. I'm a fan of Jared Diamond's book called Collapse. And in that book, one of the indicators that he identifies for impending ecological, environmental, economic, social, political collapse is the capture of the social and political agenda by one group within society, and the defiance of the needs of the majority, the public will, and the general good. And I think that pretty well captures where we are today in terms of climate change and global warming and the carbon economy, except that to the extent we don't politicize people's environmental concerns about it, all of us are essentially collaborators with the no longer slow march to catastrophe, because we participated in it and we turn the lights on and we go along with it. So we can't blame it entirely on just the corporate groups that have seen the truth and yet decide in any event to continue on the path that we're on. So we're all complicit in some sense. To what extent might the states, in the wake of Petra's kind of slightly depressing description of what took place with cap and trade, to what extent might the states provide some kind of counterpoint or some sort of political oxygen in the room? Well, let me start with the good news, because I'm from a progressive blue state, from Maryland, and I have not been in office long. I'm just finishing my second term, so I've been in for 8 years. In that time, in terms of what I've defined as a progressive agenda, we have passed marriage equality, we've abolished the death penalty, we restored voting rights to 88,000 ex-felons who had been disenfranchised for life, as in Mississippi or Alabama or Florida. We lowered the voter registration age to 16. We passed the DREAM Act, giving in-state tuition prices to the kids from undocumented families. We just passed a robust and I think secure medical marijuana program that I introduced, and we just decriminalized marijuana. So we'll stop stigmatizing and imprisoning and vilifying our own population for doing something that our last 4 or 5 presidents cheerfully concede to having done when in their days of youthful indiscretion. So we also have done some good legislation on stormwater protection, on investment in protecting the streams, the rivers, the creeks, the Chesapeake Bay against erosion and pollution. And we're making some mild progress in terms of rescuing and reviving the Chesapeake Bay. So all of that is on the positive side. I mean, certainly when you compare it to Washington, my constituents are thrilled because we're proving that government can work, it can get things done, you can set out a course, get elected on it, and push things and go in a particular direction. Now, having said that, you'll notice that of all of the things I inventoried, none of them really confronted the basic structures of corporate power that control our energy system and that pose the big environmental peril today. So, and there, the political issue is the same as it is at the federal level. It is the common good, diffusely disaggregated and only obscurely understood and not well organized or mobilized, versus a special interest which maintains a lot of secrecy and a lot of undercover darkness, but enormously powerful, driven with lots of money, lots of connections, lots of ideological power. So I guess, what I would say is that we do have to deal with the question of Citizens United and the kind of corporate takeover of constitutional jurisprudence in our country. The Roberts Court is dramatically to the right of every prior court and dramatically to the right of prior conservative justices. I mean, it was an article of constitutional faith for 2 centuries among conservative justices that a corporation is not a political rights-bearing citizen of the polity, but it's an artificial entity that, as Chief Justice John Marshall said back in the Dartmouth College case in the early 1800s, the the corporation is an artificial entity that's invisible, intangible, existing only in contemplation of law and possessing only the rights conferred upon it by the state legislature. And now Justice Roberts and this court have transformed the corporation essentially into a kind of super citizen, so that they have the free speech money rights that everybody else has, and every corporation, every corporate treasury in the country has suddenly been turned into a kind of political slush fund at the discretion of the CEOs to be unleashed in campaigns and to make sure that the whole government is tilted towards the corporate agenda and a corporate line. And there, you know, I don't use corporate as a pejorative. I use it in a descriptive way to mean small groups that have enormous amounts of economic power. And that was something that the conservative justices always understood. Rehnquist said that corporations shouldn't have political rights because they amass enormous power in the economic sphere, but it presents tremendous dangers in the political sphere, he said. Justice White, another conservative, said that, you know, the corporation's the creature of the state that's endowed with limited liability of the shareholders, like in ExxonMobil, the Valdez spill. Shareholders are only liable up to what they put in, can't come after their house or their car or anything. Perpetual life of the corporation. All of these legal entitlements and subsidies and so on. And Justice White said the state need not permit its own creature to devour it, to consume it. And that's essentially what the Roberts Court has declared is the law now, that the state must permit the corporation to consume it. So, you know, I think that our best bet is to work in dialectical union between the federal and the state levels and to fight for a constitutional amendment to nullify Citizens United, to restore the people's power to govern politics, to put corporations back in their place in the economic sphere. And like the other constitutional amendments we've had, and we've added 17 since the Bill of Rights, most of them have concerned the political rights of the people, expanding the polity to include African Americans in the 15th Amendment and women in the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage and direct election of senators in the 17th Amendment and people in D.C. getting to vote in presidential elections in the 23rd Amendment, abolition of poll taxes in the 24th, lowering the voter registration, lowering the voter age to 18 in the 26th Amendment. All of it is about democracy. And we need to pick up that thread again to say that everybody should have a right to vote because we still have millions of disenfranchised people, including ex-felons, including Washingtonians who have no representation in Congress, including people in Puerto Rico and American Samoa and the Guam and the Virgin Islands, but also to negate the proposition that this runaway Supreme Court has imposed on us, which is that corporations do have political rights. And so that constitutional amendment process, I think, if it's fused with a powerful environmental movement, could create the possibility for real action on the ground. Now, and you know, the other part of it, and I'm eager to hear what the people on the economic panel have to say, is that we need to create at the same time, in the middle of this operation, economic structures that will move us in another direction. And I've been, you know, thrilled to follow the work of Gar Alperovitz, I know, who's going to be speaking here momentarily. And I did introduce the first benefit corporation law in America, and which passed in Maryland, and it's now in, I don't know, it might be up to 13 or 14 states. And it's spreading across the country. But the idea is that, you know, we don't have to accept the dogma that a corporation means one thing and that there is some kind of constitutional template for it and that we have to bow down to the corporation and the corporate thought police, because we don't have to. The corporations should be servants of the chartering entities, which are the state legislatures, and they should advance the common good. And to the extent that they don't in, you know, these days of, you know, potential environmental catastrophe and calamity, then we should yank the charters and we should put them back in their place. But, you know, I think in the big picture, we need to somehow shift from the short-term mode of cognition and thinking, which is normal to us, I think, in our everyday lives, and certainly normal to us in politics, to a slightly longer term, a 50-year or 75-year picture. But it may be that the effects of climate change are so dramatic and so omnipresent today that it's not even going to take much imagination. I mean, it may be that we begin to react in an emergency mode, but we certainly have to mobilize people to stop believing all the propaganda, to accept as fact what science tells us is a fact, and to proceed from there. But I think that it would revive constitutional politics.
I perhaps should have mentioned that Senator Raskin is one of the country's most renowned scholars on the Supreme Court, and I bet he knows what the Lewis Powell memo is, although I won't test him on it. I have a slew of questions, but I'm going to resist moderator's privilege because I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number in the room. And I also just wanted to first check to see whether any of our panelists had any questions or remarks they wanted to make on other panelists' comments. No obligation, but we'll give panelists the first privilege, and that's also a way of letting the audience know that I believe Supriya Kumar, our communications manager, has a microphone that will be passed around, or someone else does. But first, let's, before we go to the audience, and I'll only speak my questions if things slow down, which they may well not. We have about 20 more minutes, a little bit more than that perhaps, to chat. But let me just ask whether Petra or David or Jamie have any remarks on anything anyone else said or something they forgot to say. And no more quizzes, though, Professor Orr, that's all.
I want to say I'd ask Jamie if he would move to Ohio and run for governor.
I think a lot of people who get to know Jamie feel they'd like to have them in their state too. Petra, anything?
I just wanted to echo Senator Raskin's comment about the incentives. And I did give a very bleak picture because on the federal level, it sort of was a very zero-sum game of do we pass comprehensive legislation or not. But I too would love to hear what the next panel has to say about creating positive incentives for environmentally, carbon conscious companies, because that may be one way forward.
Good. All right. I've seen three hands. I'm going to go in order. The gentleman in the blue shirt and the dark jacket, and then behind him, the gentleman just with the blue shirt, and then to the left, Ed Berry, and then a woman behind him. We'll start with those four, and then we'll go on.
Hi, I'm Ira Feldman. I wear many hats in the sustainability universe. I have a quick comment and then a quick question. On sustainability in Maryland over the last 8 years, my quick comment is in the form of three headlines. One, the smart growth legacy of the Glendening administration. Number two, the Office of Sustainable Future in the Department of Natural Resources as opposed to level of inactivity in other state agencies. And three, the O'Malley administration's embrace of genuine progress indicators. All of those relate to governance issues at the state level in Maryland. My question is actually, however, for David Orr. Jamie did raise the question of constitutional amendments, and the last time I was in the same room with David Orr 7 years ago at a reunion of President's Council on Sustainable Development participants, he spoke to me about the need for a constitutional amendment relating to sustainability, and I was wondering whether that was brought up in your forward or where you stand on that issue today.
I don't think it was in the forward.
No, that was described in an article in Orion magazine and two other places, but I've not followed up on that. In the meeting where Ira and I were in attendance, I think it was at the Wingspread. One of the things that came out of that was an effort to develop a 100-day action plan for the Obama administration or for the next U.S. administration, be it Democrat or Republican. And that effort still continues, but that was one of the outcomes from that. But nothing on an amendment.
Great. So I think I promised the floor to the gentleman with the beard and the blue shirt in the back.
Great, thank you. I'm James Nachbauer. I'm a AAAS fellow in DC. Two questions. One was about if grassroots movements need people to be articulating their own preferences and their own desires, how can top-down efforts sort of help that without modifying that or without sort of twisting it into something else? And the other is, you mentioned about a shift to longer-term thinking. It's very hard to change how people value time and their consumption and preferences. Are there institutional changes that encourage people to think longer term that you've seen actually work?
Is that addressed to me?
Yes, the last one, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, politicians just think towards the next election. So you can't get a politician to think more than 4 years in advance or 2 years, depending on the cycle. So you're not going to depend on politicians for this so much. You know, and I think that is the importance of grassroots movements. When I first got elected, I got taken out for lunch by a senator from Southern Maryland, and I was the only challenger to beat an incumbent that year in 2006. And he said, you know, Jamie, I followed your campaign, the big reformer, insurgent, outsider thing. He said, oh, that's well and good, but when you're running, it's a cesspool, but when you're in, it's a jacuzzi. And you know, this is why, you know, I wouldn't expect that from the politicians, but I'd be interested, you know, to get some cognitive science on this question of how to get people to focus on it. And, you know, maybe the environmental groups know. But again, it may be that there are just so many freakish weather events and dramatic things happening already that maybe it's not going to take that much of an active imagination for people to understand what is at stake. And then, you know, and then it's a question of, I think, linking you know, the environmental consciousness and the environmental movement with the kind of economic populism, which is still very much, you know, in the land, and the people who are pushing for constitutional change. And I think you've got the makings of a real mass movement there if we could put it together.
David? Patrick?
James, that's a really good question, and I think the one way to do this, let me give one illustration. Utilities have a roughly 20-year payback horizon. Most average utility customers have maybe a 2 to 3 year payback horizon. If you can collapse the two in a way that the public can buy, you know, install solar collectors on a house or pay for more efficiency, and add that to your bill, so it's pay on bill or any number of other mechanisms, then you can get long-term gains for people who are still fairly short-term. And poll data, I think, shows that most people do want action on climate change. They want to see the country powered by sunshine. I don't think that's changed a whole lot. But those preferences for the long term don't calibrate very well with the way we do public policy in this country. But I think these are policy changes and incentives. I don't think people are against the long term. I think advertising hurts us a bit. I think the culture's changed some in the past 40 or 50 years, but I think people still would support, given the chance to do it and the way you craft public policy mechanisms, I think people would support much longer term behavior in terms of energy and resource consumption.
You had asked also a very good question about what the larger organizations, the green groups, can do to support grassroots without co-opting those missions. And I think the short answer is, number one, money. Most of the money in the environmental movement goes to these large green groups, and it goes from a small pool of funders to a small group of national green groups. And the grassroots certainly would benefit from that kind of transfer of cash. And I think that in terms of not having their own missions co-opted, it's just a matter of, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but it is, in a sense, a matter of coordinating where it could be of benefit, where where local campaigns can become national campaigns. And I mean, in environmental issues, it should be kind of almost a no-brainer because a lot of these issues are common across the country. And the green groups stand to benefit from the input and the sort of participation of the grassroots because they provide not only the local, ground work that has to be done on these campaigns, but they provide the people. And I remember we spoke to Chris Miller, who's a senior advisor to Harry Reid, and one of the comments he made to us that really sort of surprised me, he said, you know, we support the issue, but we were surprised that there weren't more people coming to Washington to advocate for this issue. I mean, Jamie was saying that politicians are looking 4 years ahead, and that's true, but they're also sensitive to public opinion. And I think that having the bodies there is a huge part of the equation that needs to be addressed.
I think that's one of the things we wrestled with in this book was this question of how do we get those public bodies to be pushing the politicians, because ultimately you do need the public bodies, no question. Ed, did you want to? Thanks, Philip and Evan, by the way, for handling these duties.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Ed Berry with the Sustainable World Initiative, and I'm really chomping at the bit to ask Senator Raskin a question, but first I'd like to make a couple comments, one about the book. As Bob mentioned, I have just bought 6 copies of it because we're going to be sending it to all our interns as sort of pre-reading for this summer. And I'd really like to congratulate Worldwatch on an excellent book. You've really captured many different perspectives on the issue of how to better govern ourselves to fit within a finite planet. And I think that perspective is important. So not only a great book, but also a good title, Governing for Sustainability. We hear so much about environmental threats and environmental challenges and environmental solutions and better environmental governance, but really the problem is ourselves. It's governing ourselves to fit within the planet, not the other way around. The other thing I wanted to mention very briefly is that we've had a recent breakthrough at the United Nations, and that is that we've gotten countries to introduce into the dialogue of the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals the idea of a national natural resource sufficiency evaluation as a prerequisite for thinking about their development plans. And we've developed a joint statement with a couple of governments that are represented at that body that we're looking for endorsements from individuals, from global thought leaders, from nations, from NGOs. Really, we want to get a whole laundry list of endorsers around the world for this particular joint statement. So after this meeting, if any of you are interested in potentially working with us to get many endorsers to this, we'd love to share more information about that. And finally, the question for Senator Raskin. As we work with the United Nations, it's clear that the political mandate, not only here in the United States, but also around the world, is all about prosperity through economic growth. And it seems to us that we really have to change that paradigm. I'm wondering what your suggestions would be for citizens to work with politicians to change that paradigm. Thanks.
Isn't that the subject of the next panel? Yeah, no, part of it goes to the questioner who talked about the GPI, which is an attempt to create the General Prosperity Index, is that? Progress, the General Progress Indicators, okay. So, you know, part of it is, can we at least begin to change the metrics for assessing what growth and what well-being mean? And I think that, you know, spreading these alternative measures is going to be a really important part of it. So we've got something else to say, because that habit is so ingrained in the culture, in the academy, in politics, in the government, and so on. So that's one thing. I mean, another thing is that, I mean, mass movements are not just important in terms of the goals and the political objectives that they put on the public agenda, but they're also important in terms of giving people a different sense of what it means to be alive and to enjoy yourself. So you're not just locked into a system of materialism and consumerism where all that matters is how much you can accumulate. And so I think that's part of it too. I mean, if you look at the period of the decades that began in the 1960s with the civilizing movements, the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the gay movement and the peace movement, they did create an alternative structure of values for people to enjoy themselves and to define their lives, so that it wasn't just kind of the financial rat race, you know. So, I mean, those would be a couple of things that I would put on the table, along with whatever alternative economic structures like the co-ops and the benefit corporations that we're able to do to give, you know, people another sense of identity and economic security, so that we're, you know, I mean, we have, let me just give you one example, because I don't want to make it seem like the predatory power of special interest takes place just in Washington, because we know that that's not true. I mean, we had a piece of just rank corporate welfare relating to, you know, one of the well, I'll just say its name, Lockheed Martin, and we were basically all swept away by, not everybody, but we were swept away by basically the belief that there's no way that you can challenge the needs and the wishes of the largest corporations. And even if those corporations get all of their money or 98% of their money from the taxpayers, because of their relationship to federal contracting and so on. So it's a very pernicious philosophy that has developed, which is that the public good has got to be subordinate to the demands of particular industries. And that's something that I think pervades our politics, and for reasons of saving the earth, we've got to turn the right side around. And by the way, that was a major concern of the founders of the United States. I mean, if you go back and you read the Federalist Papers and you read Madison, it was all about how you control the power of factions. That, whether it's a majority oppressing a minority, which is what we've had in racial terms for most of our history, or whether it's a minority that has wealth and power and money and it oppresses the majority or sidelines the interests of the majority of the people. So, that is the fundamental question.
I understand. Lynn Cheney, of all people, has just written a biography of Madison in which he makes exactly that point, that he was, in fact, about the government's capacity to control faction as being essential to the survival of the nation. So you're in agreement, apparently, with Lynn Cheney on this one, Jamie.
It probably doesn't go much further than that.
I think there was a woman right behind Ed Evans, so she has the mic. And then we'll take a new round, but we'll I'll probably only be able to call on one more person because at 3:15, maybe two, we'll see how it goes, but we're going to break about 3:15. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Farah from Enterprise Service. I have a question for Senator Raskin and perhaps for Professor Orr. Senator Raskin, you mentioned the criticism of corporations and, basically them being super citizens. And I can't help but think about Foucault's kind of criticism of neoliberal capitalism and the notion of governmentalization, where corporations basically work with governments, which is not necessarily good for the other people, and it undermines democracy ultimately. And with the recent kind of movements for more egalitarian and anti-inequality movements, do you think that there is a kind of this momentum where the U.S. Perhaps has to reconsider the neoliberal capitalism and kind of switch to more green capitalism with a human face? And do you think this is possible in the nearest horizon? Thank you.
Yeah, again, not to delegate everything to the next panel, but I think that's what it's about, which is, again, I don't believe, either, in Milton Friedman or Karl Marx or anybody who says that that economics is determined by iron laws of history. I really do think that's up to us if we can reassert our sovereign role as people in politics who can shape and define what our economic and social institutions are like. And I think we can. I think that we've got the political power to do it if we've got the will and the imagination to do it. And so, the only thing I would take issue with a little bit in your statement was, I'm not interested in, an economic system or a capitalism, I think you said, with a human face. I think it should be, we should organize the whole economy around the needs of human beings. And that's the human heart and the human mind, and nothing cosmetic, but I think that, we've got it within our power to create an economy that's like that. But we do have to take back our politics in a big way from just big concentrated money power.
That's a really good question, and it does go to the next panel, but there has been a movement for some time by a lot of folks, and well-known in this room, to think about natural capital. And you think about natural capital, and it comes in four forms. It comes in money capital, machinery, and so forth, and that's physical capital over here, and then it comes also as what's called human capital, and that's you and me, and nature services. And the theory is that you can collapse these into a single metric. But on the one side, those run by the laws of greed and accumulation. On the other side, they run by the laws of foresight and affection. And the theory is you can condense all that into a single metric. And on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I think maybe possible, perhaps, if, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, no way, no how. And Sunday, I rest. The issue here is when Václav Havel was writing about the time the Iron Curtain came down, he said the communism collapsed first, but the capitalism will not be far behind it. And the acid test, I think, is coming up. And this is this capacity to sequester roughly 20, give or take, $20 trillion of fossil fuels that we cannot burn without risking or probably pushing us over the tip and frying the planet. And that's going to be the rights of humans and survival and people and all that we value in the world versus the rights of capital. And I think the jury is still out. And one other comment on this, I think for every Ray Anderson and Interface Corporation you could find, a green corporation, you could also find on the extraction side of the economic ledger, you can find really, really bad people, and if you don't, and bad companies. And if you don't believe that, just take a flyover for mountaintop removal sites in West Virginia, just south of Charleston. And what's happened there is simply insane for no good purpose whatsoever. And so I think the jury's out on capitalism, but thanks for the question.
Good discussion, and we are just about out. So the only moderator's privilege I think I will exert is to ask whether whether we could prioritize a short question without necessarily proceeding comment for Petra. Does anyone have a particular question they would like to ask to Petra? Oh, it's going to be tough. Now I've got to make Hobson's choices. This is tough, Edie. I'm sorry, but is it okay? The gentleman back here, I don't think he said anything.
I'm Mike McCracken from the Climate Institute. I'm Mike McCracken from the Climate Institute. I guess my question is, did this problem of environmental groups focusing too narrowly perhaps also go back to the Kyoto Protocol, when they kept pushing for very hard, stringent actions that basically forced some countries to withdraw, as opposed to getting signatures on something and then strengthening over time, which was sort of what happened with the ozone protocol?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question.
I'll come in and savor in this respect. I wrote about that process. I wrote about the ozone process as a journalist, and Kyoto more from a policy research perspective. But I know certainly from the standpoint of the United States, there was a lot of thought that there was just an air of fantasy about whether the Kyoto Protocol could pass the U.S. Senate. And there was a lot of criticism to the U.S. delegation, and in fact to Al Gore at the time, for encouraging the belief among NGOs and others who worked so hard in the Kyoto Protocol that it would have a remote chance of passing the U.S. Senate. So in that sense, I think this problem of the Senate is really an interesting and important one. As I mentioned in my own remarks, how do you convince 67 senators to support a treaty that is perceived as any climate agreement is going to put the United States at a relative disadvantage relative to the rest of the world compared to the advantage that we now enjoy to freely use massive amounts of carbon? I knew that would do it. Go ahead.
I did want to add just that I think that the larger green groups in the country continue not to see the political landscape in a realistic way. And that was something that we were struck by over and over as we did our reporting, that we actually heard from the leaders of green groups who said, jobs are not an issue that concern us. That's not what we do. And that is a huge oversight. I think it was Francis Beinecke who said that on the record for our report. So I think there has to be a realignment of expectations of what is realistic to achieve and what are the real concerns of the constituencies that you're trying to approach to enact this change.
Francis is a wonderful person, but I was dismayed to see that quote in your chapter. There were several other questioners. We do have another panel. If you can find a way to ask something related to your question and make it about economic governance, which some of these questions clearly were, please bring it up then. As it stands, we are going to take a half an hour, maybe slightly under half an hour break. Ooh, 15 minutes, excuse me. This is what happens when you substitute a moderator and don't give him his basic training. A 15-minute or less, we've been pretty much on schedule. Kudos to all of our panel speakers and everyone, and the questioners as well for being quite disciplined. We're just a little bit behind, so we'll try to make it just basically a bathroom break, a 10-minute panel without a lot of 10-minute break without a lot of socializing, and then we'll have our second panel, which Tom will moderate. Thank you.